It's no secret that a ton of us currently have Dragon Ball on our minds, with the new game Dragon Ball FighterZ being a huge success, Dragon Ball Super coming to an end, and most excitingly of all, the upcoming Dragon Ball movie. It may not be much of a surprise when I say that I'm a huge fan of the Dragon Ball franchise, and honestly I could talk about any facet of this franchise to a great length, except for current events in Super as I'm not caught up, and GT as I never finished watching it. But for the sake of today's video, I want to talk about the video games, in particular the Budokai series, which was most likely the first DBZ game series any North American fan ever played. But don't be mistaken, obviously there have been Dragon Ball games in Japan for about as long as Dragon Ball itself has existed. Even in North America we've had DB games since 1986, though I guess since Dragon Power was pretty much stripped from its Dragon Ball identity, most people won't consider that the first English Dragon Ball game. So pushing that to the side, the real first English Dragon Ball game was a little game called Final Bout, and I don't blame you if you've never heard of it because it just sucks and the voice acting in the game is just really weird.
All right now!
Now let me show you the force of my true power.
After Final Bout, a few more games made their way to the West, all with varying degrees of quality, and while I haven't played every single one of them, it seems safe to assume they were pretty much forgettable. And then in late 2002 we were graced with Dragon Ball Z Budokai, and it critically received decent reviews I guess, but to fans of Dragon Ball Z at the time, this game was amazing. Finally a way to play through the story that wasn't a clunky mess like the Legacy of Goku, and a way to battle with your friends that wasn't in the form of the god-awful Final Bout. And yes, before even getting into it, I can say without a doubt DBZ Budokai is a vast improvement over Final Bout in every conceivable way. There's a reason that it got 2 sequels, folks, and today I'm going to take a look at all 3 games in the series. Though before we get into that, I've got to be honest. Yes, I do love Dragon Ball to death, but I'm not someone who's been a die-hard fan since childhood. I caught a few episodes here and there, and had a few tapes as a kid, but at the time I never was really into it. Because of this, I never grew up playing the Budokai games either. In fact, my only childhood experiences of the games were watching friends play them, and that was about it. It wasn't until many years later, after I started really getting into anime, that I finally decided to give the original Dragon Ball anime a shot, and it didn't take long for me to realize just how great this franchise is. So then a few years later I picked up a copy of Budokai 1 and played through it, but the other 2 games I never played until I decided to make this video. So if my reviews of these games sound a bit off compared to someone who has more nostalgia for them, then there's your answer. But without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at Dragon Ball Z Budokai for the PlayStation 2. Upon starting Budokai 1, you will be greeted with a recreation of the first Dragon Ball Z opening. However, if you're playing the English version, instead of the music being Hironobu Kageyama's legendary Cha-La Head-Cha-La, you get the drastically inferior Rock the Dragon song used in the Funimation dub, and it doesn't match the visuals at all. Speaking of the visuals, they're okay. A lot of the character models look really disproportionate when compared to their anime and manga counterparts, and the animation during cutscenes is really stiff. At times it makes the characters look like those really creepy dolls that every grandmother has an unsettling amount of. During gameplay, however, the animation is perfectly fine, so at the end of the day, these anomalies aren't anything major. While the visual side of things definitely isn't perfect, the music department definitely kicks things up a few notches, and then some. Rather than try to emulate the original anime soundtrack, composer Kenji Yamamoto opted to do something a little more unique for these games, and it works quite well. A real shame that the man was outed to be a plagiarist years later, but we'll come back to that later. Now that all of that is out of the way, let's get into the meat and potatoes of the game. There are 4 distinct gameplay modes to choose from, those being the story, versus, tournament, and Legend of Hercule, which has to be unlocked. Though the game's core mechanics stay the same through each mode. It's a one-on-one fighter where you have to use punch and kick combos along with ki blasts to deplete your opponent's health before they deplete yours. You fight on a 2D plane like most fighting games, but you can freely move around the stages akin to Tekken or Soul Calibur. Just like the series it's based on, you can take battles into the air by either knocking your opponent in the air or vice versa. What's really odd, however, is that you can't jump, but perhaps that design decision was made because you can fly, and it might have made things things too complicated. The main aspect that makes Budokai unique from other fighting games is the skill system. Skills are equipable items that can give your character stat boosts, allow you to perform new attacks, or give you access to character transformations. Skills can be earned by playing through the story mode, and also through buying them at the skill shop with the zenny that you earn while playing through the tournament mode. You can then customize your character with your unlocked skills and use them in either the versus or tournament modes. However, if you don't care about that kind of customization, you can choose to play as a character with a normal skill set for the sake of having a better balance. The story mode doesn't give you the ability to customize skills either, but rather starts each battle off with a certain set of skills to be a more accurate portrayal of the storyline. Now that we've got the basic gameplay out of the way, let's talk about the different modes on offer in more detail. Story mode has you playing through the original DBZ story arcs up through the Cell arc, but it also has some interesting what-if scenarios on the side if you decide to revisit it. It does a decent enough job of recapping the monstrous story of DBZ, but if you've never watched the anime or read the manga, this is by no means a replacement for them, and I imagine a lot of this would seem nonsensical to anyone unfamiliar with the source material. For the majority of the story mode, you'll be playing as Goku in his iconic battles, but sometimes things switch up a bit and you'll get to control other characters and do things outside of fighting, like these training mini-games during the Namek arc, and this minigame where you have to charge Piccolo's attack against Raditz while he makes this uncomfortable grunt. It's overall a competent mode, but I do have some gripes with it. Sometimes the characters you'll be fighting will be way too overpowered. Particularly, they'll have more health bars than you do, and I understand that this is done to make it more accurate to the story, but it can get a little grating. In addition to this, as I mentioned before, there is no way to edit your skills in this mode. This is also an obvious attempt to make things more accurate, but at times it just makes your moveset feel a little too limited. At the very least, I would have liked to have the option to edit skills when replaying through the story mode, but I suppose at the end of the day it's a minor nitpick. Versus mode is exactly what you think it is. Battle with a CPU or a friend, pick your favorite characters, pick your favorite stage, and have at it. That's about all there is to it. The tournament mode is a staple through the whole trilogy, unsurprisingly, as if you're a Dragon Ball fan then you know how iconic the tournament arcs are. They work here pretty much the same way they do in the anime. You fight through multiple tiers to become the #1 fighter and win the prize money. However, this time it's not just a matter of trying to deplete your opponent's HP. You can also win instantly by knocking them out of bounds. However, they can just as easily knock you out of bounds, so this is where the game's 3D movement really comes in handy. You have to try and evade your opponent while simultaneously avoiding the edge of the ring. It's a really fun mode and a very easy way to grind Zenny so that you can unlock more skills. However, I do have a few nitpicks. For one thing, I don't like that you have to unlock the higher difficulties by purchasing them in the skill shop. I personally think that difficulty mode should be unlocked from the start, or at the very least don't make me waste my Zenny on them. I also wish that it was possible to skip the transitions between each map, but it's not that much of a problem. The last mode we have is the unlockable Legend of Hercule, where you can play as Hercule, to battle all of the fighters at the Cell games under various conditions. It's a really fun mode, and Hercule himself is just a great character to play as. It's totally worth unlocking, especially if you're a fan of Hercule. That's about all there is to say about Budokai 1. It's definitely far from being a deep fighting game, and certain aspects do feel clunky, like doing a Kamehameha, but for the time it came out, this was the ideal Dragon Ball game, and no matter what your opinion is on the game these days, you have to admit that it's 10 times better than the garbage released on the PS1. Even the marketing team would agree with that.
What if it was the only role left? Love Dragon Ball Z? Get Ultimate Battle 22, the import for the PlayStation game console.
So, you could do better than Budokai 1, but you could do much worse, and for less than $10, if you're a Dragon Ball fan and you haven't played this game, I would recommend picking up a copy and at least playing through the story mode. This game was released at a very convenient time in the US. DBZ was still airing on Toonami, and it was all the rage. So much so that a majority of the game's sales came from the North American audience. And that's very likely the reason that merely a year later the game got a sequel. So without further ado, let's move on to DBZ Budokai 2. Rather than start off with an unsettling recreation of one of the anime openings, Budokai 2 opens up with a completely original animated FMV with a brand new song by the legendary Hironobu Kageyama. Well, if you're playing the American version, you only get the instrumental, but it still sounds nice. Once you get into the game, the most apparent change is the graphical style. This time around, everything is cel-shaded, and this approach definitely does justice to Toriyama's art style. style. Also on the subject of graphics, the models have been tweaked to where everything looks pretty much as it should. I never noticed any of the anomalies that were present in the first game, such as Kid Gohan being too tall or Vegeta's head being too small. With all of these changes and improvements to the graphics, I really have no gripes with the way the game looks at all. They even went through and updated the heads-up display to have a little more personality. That may seem like a small detail, but it just looked so dull in the first game. The soundtrack is basically the same as the first game, but with a few new tracks sprinkled in, and Yamamoto even collaborated with the guitarist from Tower of Power, so that's something. However, the gameplay remains largely unchanged, sans one huge improvement, and that improvement is now characters can perform fireball attacks, such as the Kamehameha, by simply pressing forward and the key button at the same time. You can still execute these moves by doing the standard combo, but it's not really satisfying to land it at point-blank range, at least not to me. So far, this game seems to be vastly superior to the original, but the question remains, are the game modes on offer here any good? Budokai 2's new attractions are the Dragon World mode and the unlockable Babidi Spaceship mode. The Versus and World Tournament modes make their return from the first game, but since nothing's changed about them since the first game, I won't really talk about them. Dragon World is where you'll be spending the majority of your single-player time, as it's essentially the game's story mode. This game was put in an interesting spot when it comes to what it could possibly do with its story mode. It's off the heels of a game where the story mode was a literal retelling of Dragon Ball Z, where you watch cutscenes and fight in between them. However, it only went up through the cell art, so they can't just really continue off of where the last game ended because it's just not enough content there. But at the same time, they can't just do the same thing from the beginning and just attach Majin Buu at the end, as it would be incredibly redundant. So Budokai 2 just decided to go off and do its own thing. This time around, the story isn't really the focus and is only loosely followed, as it takes a backseat to this board game setup where you move Goku and other characters of your choosing around the boards, defeating enemy pieces while collecting skills and new characters to play as. Right off the bat, one thing I can say I really like about this mode over the first game is the fact that you can now edit your skills at any time on the map. Unfortunately, that's about the only thing I like about this mode. To progress in this mode, you typically have one major boss you have to face on each board, but in addition to this, there will be several enemy pieces on each board as well, and the problem is they have multiple health points. So in order to completely defeat them, you have to go back and fight them multiple times. It's so mundane, and you better hope they don't go to a nearby Dende spot and get an extra health point. I could probably live with bosses needing to be beaten multiple times, but having to constantly fight Cybermen and Cell Juniors ad nauseum will just take a toll on you. It's also really easy up until you get to the Majin Buu arc, where the difficulty just massively spikes out of nowhere. In addition to fighting enemies, there are other things that you can do on the board, like picking up skills, zenny, and items that can increase your defense and attack power. Enemy pieces can also pick these up too, so if you have your eyes set on something, you better make a beeline towards it. In addition to that, you can also pick up a Dragon Ball on each board until you collect all 7. But to be honest, the process of collecting the Dragon Balls wasn't very well conveyed. The first Dragon Ball is out plain as day on the first board, but all the other ones aren't. You can grab Dragon Radars to find their location, but I initially thought I had to do something specific to trigger them to pop up at these locations. After looking up a video, I learned that all you have to do is go to the location on the radar and just dig in that spot, which was something that I didn't even know you could do. To be fair though, it does tell you how to dig on the map, but I never paid attention to that. I feel like it would have been better to give the player a little nudge on the first map to dig up the ball there so that you would know how to get the rest of the balls. This may seem like a bit of a nitpick, and I guess to a certain extent it is, but on my first playthrough I only got the first ball, and even though I had finished the story mode, I still had to start from the beginning and play through everything again and grab all the Dragon Balls while doing so. When you do complete the story mode with all 7 balls, you can unlock the Babidi Spaceship mode, where you play through 4 different stages multiple times to grind enough killie to awaken Majin Buu, I guess. In the first stage, you have to knock out as many low health opponents as you can before you get KO'd. In the second stage, you're pitted against an invincible opponent and have to survive as long as possible. In the third stage, you have to land as many hits as you can on your opponent before time runs out. And the final stage has you volleying Ki Blast with your opponent for as long as possible. It's a pretty fun mode at first, but it doesn't take long for it to start feeling redundant, as you only have these 4 stages to cycle through over and over until you filled up the killie gauge. It's not a bad mode, but could have had some better variety. Interestingly enough, this mode does have multiplayer, and I am actually curious how much this changes the experience, but most of my friends would rather play something like Dragon Ball FighterZ over these old PS2 games, so it goes without saying that I didn't get to try that out. So when it comes to the core gameplay and presentation, Budokai 2 is quite a step up from its predecessor. However, when it comes to the single-player content, it's honestly just as much of a step down. While I do admire the story mode for trying to do something different, it definitely could have been improved, and while I don't find Babidi's spaceship to be bad, I didn't find it to be anywhere near as fun as the Legend of Hercule mode in the previous game. If you do find this game really cheap and just really want to have a fun time with a friend, then it might be worth picking up to play a few versus matches, as the gameplay here is a bit more fluid than the first game, but aside from that, I really can't recommend picking this game up. Despite my feelings on the game, however, it was still a massive hit in terms of sales, and the dev team knew they had to keep the momentum going for at least one more game, which brings me to the final numbered entry in the series, Budokai 3. Budokai 3 doesn't fail to make a good first impression with another great FMV intro with another fantastic Kageyama song that I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce. Of course, if you're playing an American copy, then it only has the instrumental, which admittedly still sounds nice, and was even my intro music for a very brief period of time. On a more technical note, this game is one of the few PS2 games capable of running at 480p, which is why the footage of this game is going to look a little cleaner than the other games. So already things are off to a good start, but as was the case with the last game, improved cosmetics don't mean a thing if the game itself isn't substantial enough. So let's get into that. The core gameplay has two major new additions, the first of which is Dragon Rush, where if you send your opponent flying, you and your opponent will go through a series of rock, paper, scissors-esque segments, and if you successfully go through all of the segments, you'll be able to complete an ultimate move. However, at the end of the day, it's completely RNG, so I personally could have done without this mechanic. The second new addition is Hyper Mode, which can be activated by pressing L2. Once it's activated, your character will turn red and your ki gauge will start to deplete. While in this mode, your attack power will increase, but if you don't do an ultimate attack on your opponent before your ki drains, you'll be left stunned. So needless to say, it's not a good idea to just constantly go into hyper mode. These mechanics definitely shake things up and make the game feel fresh after playing the previous two, and even though I'm not a fan of Dragon Rush while fighting the CPU, it is kind of fun when you're playing against a friend. As far as new single player modes go, we have Dragon Universe and the unlockable Dragon Arena. Dragon Universe is the same deal as the previous two games in terms of the story, but it's split into smaller segments for individual characters, and they don't take very long to finish. You just fly around as your character and go to specified areas to fight enemies and such. It's very basic, but I'll take this over 2's weird board game setup. As you win fights, you gain experience points and you can level up different attributes of your character, which is a nice touch. Although you can easily just head towards the specified areas, there are hidden items, skills, and secret characters to battle if you choose to go out of your way to find them. There's also Dragon Balls to collect along the way, but they're a bit irritating to collect. You can find Dragon Radars to help, but the radar map is so zoomed in that you really don't see the ball locations until you're right on top of them. So honestly, I would just recommend looking up the locations online. The way the story is presented isn't anything special in all honesty. It's just told through these 2D character cutouts, and honestly it comes off as kind of lazy. But other than that, this mode isn't really bad overall, but just a little too simple. Once you finish Dragon Universe with all the characters, you'll unlock the Dragon Arena mode where you can take your characters from the Dragon Universe and level them up even further by battling high-level CPU. In fact, you can play as any characters that you have unlocked in this mode. There's no frills about it, just fight and level up. I actually got quite a bit of enjoyment out of this, and while I was recording footage for this video, I spent way longer on this mode than I had intended. It's just really satisfying to level up and increase a character's power. Speaking of characters, there are a lot of them in this game. Some odd choices like Cell Jr. and Cyberman, but there's also some pretty nice choices like Cooler, Broly, and even Kid Goku. If you're a Dragon Ball fan in any form, this game is just oozing with fan service, and there should be at least one thing in this game that will make you say,
nice.
Budokai 3 is definitely the best game in the series when it comes to its basic gameplay, but the story mode still isn't quite as strong as the first game, and while that might not be such a big deal to some, to others it can be a deal breaker. Overall though, Budokai 3 is a great game, and if you just want a good Dragon Ball fighting game to play, this is the one to get. It's a little more expensive than the other two games, but I'd still say it's worth it. Overall, none of the games in the series are bad at all, but honestly there's just not much of a reason to go back to the second game, and that's probably why it was omitted from the HD collection that was released in 2012. And if you're wondering why I didn't use any footage from that collection, well, it's mainly because I don't own it, but also I don't really have a desire to for one particular reason. The soundtrack is completely different in this release. As I said way earlier, Kenji Yamamoto was outed to be a plagiarist, so he had to sever all ties with Dragon Ball. It's an understandable reason, but I'm just not a fan of the music that was added in. Your mileage may vary on this, and aside from the music, the HD collection does seem to be pretty well done and it looks really nice, so if you want to pick it up for yourself, then go for it. But as for me, I'll just stick with the original PS2 versions. So at the end of the day, if you prefer playing fighting games for the single player content, you'll probably be most satisfied with the first game, but if you want something with deeper mechanics and to have fun with a friend, then Budokai 3 reigns supreme. Though if you can't find a copy of 3, then 2 is pretty serviceable in those regards as well, but you aren't missing much if you choose to avoid it. Though with all that said, I'm not really a pro fighting game player. I'm just a scrub, so people who are into more advanced and traditional fighters may just want to skip this series altogether. However, earlier this year, Bandai Namco and Arc System Works brought us Dragon Ball FighterZ with the intent of bridging the gap between hardcore players and scrubs like myself, but whether they actually succeeded in doing so or not, we'll find out next time. This has been FumeiCom, and I'll see you guys at the same time, same place, different game.